Hello, everyone, and welcome to the new episode of Taboola Talks. Today's guest is someone that I have had the absolute pleasure of working with very closely and who has been the guiding force of the erstwhile SMB and the current growth advertising team. It is said that familiarity breeds contempt. But in these 2.5 years, if at all, there has been an increased admiration and respect towards Ken. And in many ways, it is down to his curiosity, which makes him a great leader. Thank you very much, Ken, for speaking with me on Taboola Talks.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Ken. So the first thing that I want to ask you is when you took on this role of leading this globally distributed CSM team, what did you think was going to be your biggest challenge? And what were the areas you focused on in the initial phase?
It's an interesting question. Generally speaking, and this is something I take from a few of Taboola's senior leaders. I kind of start with the opportunity. I think when I made the decision to take this role, it was very clear to me that some of the most successful advertisers with Taboola are small and medium businesses. I can speak for days about why I believe this is a hugely exciting segment of business for Taboola and otherwise. But I think Taboola's value proposition is very carefully aligned with some of these, smaller, certainly like the more kind of digital first businesses. And then I think I spoke to Eldad and I asked him, well, what would blow your mind if we deliver in the next, 12 to 18 months? And his response was, I wish that our advertising client-facing teams had a bit more of a methodology. I think you referred to the publisher-facing teams having a bit more of a science than an art, and there was, let's say, a catch-up opportunity there. Mm-hmm. And so, you can totally speak to that as a challenge, but mm-hmm. That's the opportunity. That was the objective. Mm-hmm. And then I think as you mentioned, this is a globally distributed team, which is kind of it's a two-edged sword in the sense that, we have people like, Hikaru from Japan that has been, when I joined the team, I think he's been on the team for 2 years, and we had people in New York that joined that month. So a really wide and, with the varying experience in industry. So, the blessing or the advantage was that we were able to meet the wide gamut of opportunities with a wide gamut of talented, passionate people with like different skill sets. The drawback was, as I sometimes like to call it, it's like herding cats, which is a very peculiar expression. So, how do you make all of these people feel connected? How do you find the synergies? How do you find what is common rather than, I guess, only what is mutually exclusive? So I think that was a big challenge. I think on a kind of more personal and broader note, I think coming into a leadership role, which is something, you and I share because we joined this team, I wouldn't say exactly the same time, slightly different let's say, approach coming into it. But as I've had the opportunity to spend a year in Taboola's, headquarters in Israel, which is something that was a huge lever in our team's growth, is that bringing in a leader is a bit of a organ transplant. Some would even say a brain transplant, but not that type of thing exists, where the body can arguably, it can be the best liver, the best brain anybody has ever seen, best shape, but the body might reject it. So I think, I don't know if the word challenges totally captures it, but it was absolutely critical for me to, for me as a contributor to this team to be quote unquote accepted. I think people who have worked with me, such as this is not, I try to move with conviction, and I have generally like firm opinions about things. And I think that was a very important kind of personal or professional growth opportunity to kind of suspend disbelief or criticism of how things used to work. First, spend a long time listening, and I'm extending your answer to also talk about how I met the challenge.
Sure.
But I think that was super, super critical. So, to kind of summarize, I think there was a huge opportunity because, frankly, with small business, there are a ton of them. I think the value proposition that Taboola is kind of, and this is not too dissimilar to a Facebook or any kind of market maker, small businesses are huge beneficiary of, that kind of leveled playing field that those type of digital platforms propose. I think historically with Taboola, a lot of these what used to be called SMB and our growth of advocates have been very successful. So it was really a lot about kind of understanding what made the few successful and then kind of replicate it, which ties into the thing that Eldad highlighted around, well, we need a methodology. So, a methodology to do what? To replicate that correct approach to unlock success. And then, from a challenges perspective, I think from a distributed team, the diversity, thinking about diversity of a team, geographic and otherwise, as both, a blessing and a curse, or, there's some challenges and some beautifully, useful things about it. And then I guess the last piece, which is universal, it's not specific to growth or a globally distributed team. When a leader comes, let's say later in the stage of an organization, if there's a quote that I don't remember who's the person, but I really liked. A leader who nobody follows is just a guy taking a walk. So you have to kind of get the buy-in, and specifically for me as a human that is relatively critical and has firm opinions about how to do things, that required taking a piece of humble pie and kind of seeing the things in the most positive light and understanding the motivations that everybody on the team has, and only then start to think about change. And we can talk more about like the changes we've gone through and I've attempted to inspire.
Sure, Ken. So in a sense, this one answer kind of lays out the agenda that I have for the next 20 minutes, because a lot of questions that I have are actually centered around some of the aspects that you already touched, but I'll probably want to go into greater detail in the next couple of minutes. But before I get there, now I have seen you speak on this topic at a couple of conferences. You just mentioned you could perhaps go on speaking about this for the next few days. But if you could probably in the next couple of minutes quickly tell us as to what about working with the SMBs excites you the most? Why do you think small businesses are a big deal?
So small businesses are a big deal. I think I mentioned it. It's the other 60% of in our domain, digital advertising revenue. But I think which I'm obviously by being a bit facetious, it's most of the money. It's definitely the crushing majority of the businesses. The challenge is very much aligned with my, let's again say, personal passions around. If you have a different way to look at it is like whatever 40% of the digital advertising budget in the world are concentrated in like 200 companies, which micron of that of the total population. And what that means to some people, okay, Pareto distribution, let's focus on the few that has the most mass. And I'm saying, well, as a company, we definitely want to capture both, but the challenge with kind of capturing the other 60% that's distributed across many advertisers is again through that methodology and figuring out scalable or scaled solutions to kind of capture it. And in my training, I'm a trained engineer, and my parents like to say I was an engineer before I went to the Technion. So that's very much that type of challenge. The opportunity is obviously very attractive, but the challenge is very much aligned with what I like to do. Like in enterprise, I think every customer is a snowflake, and rightfully so. I think with SMB and growth, I think there's an opportunity to kind of think, I guess, identify the patterns and the methodologies that kind of unlock, and the companies that get that right Think of like HubSpot I think is a great example in the marketing space for a fantastic SMB player. There's a huge premium for doing it right. So I think that's kind of one aspect to this, which is again very innate to me. I think there's something else about, again, specifically about my personality. I'm relatively service-oriented versus say, commercial or like problem solving oriented. And I think, for a service-oriented person, what you really want is to feel like you are helping somebody else with your consult, with your knowledge, with whatever. And I think, with enterprise, very often, and rightfully so, these companies know what they're doing, and you're just another little piece in their puzzle. But with small businesses, they're very good at whatever it is, making pens or whatever it might be, but they might not necessarily understand digital advertising to be very specific or even more specifically with Taboola. And that creates a huge opportunity because they allow you to, the opportunity is there for you to actually influence them because they will view you as an expert. So I think, that sense of efficacy, that ability to influence, so that's super attractive. The other thing that I am, which again, people in Taboola would know, is I'm not the most patient human. And enterprise takes patience or requires patience, and talk to 5 different people to get a decision like let's launch a new line of business or let's enter a new geographical marketplace. With growth or small businesses, you typically have a one person that can drive a decision end to end, from owning the budget to executing, to even sometimes doing technical stuff like creating a dedicated localized landing page, and that creates a shorter feedback loop, which I find very energizing. And then I think also on I guess the last piece is there is something very almost like a social benefit aspect to it. Or social impact aspect to it, on helping people put food on the table.
Sure.
Specifically, if we're thinking about, COVID was a time where, all crisis, like it was a terrible time for the world in many, many, many ways. However, I think it also created lots of opportunities for people who are adaptable. And so,
That's
helping
right.
some of those smaller businesses capture the opportunity because they are flexible, because they can move
Sure.
fast, has been very, very rewarding. And I wanna maybe credit myself with the foresight of you saying, this is how SMBs create. But certainly, the COVID-19 pandemic kind of
Sure.
established.
Sure. So,
yeah.
of the many things that you said, there is one thing which you mentioned around getting it right, because there is a massive opportunity, but then the fact that it is not really as simple as going after a focused group and then getting something out of it. It's a business which is widely spread. A single approach or a strategy may not necessarily work. At the same time, it's important to actually have a methodology so that you can scale it. So from that standpoint, how do you come up with a strategic direction for this growth org that helps you to be prepared for the current scenario and also the future challenges?
I think it's a complex answer, it's a complex question, but so I'm going to try and kind of go one at a time. I think as a strategy in Taboola and previous businesses I've worked with, there's like a Peter Thiel quote, which says, learning from failure is overrated, which sounds contrarian, which is he's the poster boy for being contrarian. But I think even from a statistics and kind of machine learning perspective, rings very true to me in the sense that in layman terms, and engagement or a business can go wrong for a million different ways. I think he talks about in the context of startups: wrong timing, wrong product, wrong team, wrong a million things. But when you and then if you analyze, okay, this is the failure, it's a combination of failure, I'm going to try and avoid it, then it doesn't help you avoid the million other things that could have gone wrong. However, when you look at something gone right, you're like, okay, they had the right team. What about this team was right? They had the right product at the right time. Why? They had the right, pricing strategy. There's much more to learn. And also, again, if you think about it from an almost technical perspective, kind of machine learning algorithm gets way more value or is able to exhaust to leverage it in a much better way. If, say in our world, a user gets a conversion, which is a rare event, buys headphones, versus the hundreds of clicks that don't. So with that in mind, the way I go about it again in Taboola and previous businesses as well, is just like, well, who's successful? Specifically, which customers are successful? So, starting with a customer, I think is very often used, to say the least type thing, and being customer centric. So obviously we start with the customer, and then the question is which customer, and I'm saying, okay, let's start with the successful customers. And then, specifically in the story for growth, I think what we found is, software conversions, advertisers targeting software conversions, like, leads have been successful. And then, advertisers that are very agile and flexible, I guess, like, affiliate marketeers that can literally shift between selling insurance leads to selling, smartwatches relatively quickly, kind of ride the waves as they come. I think, and then, then you start building a thesis about why is that the case.
Sure.
And I can try and speak to why I believe Taboola is better geared towards delivering software conversions versus, more, let's call it high value conversions like purchases and whatnot. But I think that's a bit beside the point. The important thing is like, okay, what are these people doing, or how big is the market for these, and how can we, and this has been the kind of, I think, guiding principle, how can we make sure that every advertiser that say targets leads in, let's say, whatever market we have a ton of inventory on, like let's say the US, everyone is successful. How do we move the success rate from, let's say, 50% or whatever it was to 80% or 90% or even 100%?
Sure.
And I think, from a strategy, without getting too deep into, the execution and or building like an action plan around it, that has been the guiding principle, which you can think about it as a bit of like, a low-hanging fruit type strategy. It's not, I don't think it's like rocket science. But I think the, let's say, somewhat less intuitive or trivial thing about it is like, I feel like once you've cracked that, you're in a much better position to go after a more complex or a trickier piece of segment of market or customer profile, because you can leverage some of those learnings. Because some of the ideas that you picked up, so for instance, in the case of activation, kind of what is the leading metric, I think you can leverage it with relatively minor tweaks to drive the correct behavior with a different type of customer, because a lot of the infrastructure can be reused, let's say.
Sure. And I guess the underlying principle pretty much remains the same. And in a sense, what you spoke of, I mean, thinking of it from the customer standpoint, ensuring that, whatever is the metric that makes them successful, I think starting from there could be a good anchor for us kind of going forward. So continuing on the same thing, Ken, now, for us to be able to kind of drive these strategies, kind of have these methodologies, it becomes kind of important to have processes and tools in place. Now, when you do it, there is always a risk of overdoing it, which in turn could defeat the entire purpose. So how do you then balance it out? And what is the trigger that actually makes you want to introduce or change an existing process?
I think it's a beautiful point, and I can't say that I have a silver bullet. I think it's something that a company should always, certainly the company and the leaders in it should always be conscious of, like, when do we have process for process? When is a process no longer appropriate or relevant to the current reality and any sorts of things? I think minor reference, No Rules Rules, the Reed Hastings that I forgot the co-author, name, do an interesting job at like talking about this. I think more on kind of like the admin process rather than like the core service practices in our world side or whatnot. So 100%, I think it's an interesting point, and I can't say that I've cracked it. The one thing that I'll say that we have been doing, which I think is the appropriate way, is and this is about getting kind of grassroots buy-in. I think people respond better to, certainly the people we try to hire, which have like a sense of self-direction and self-efficacy and all of that. You start to say, well, this is the goalpost. Like find your way to the goalpost. And then after, if they find it, happy days. No need for process, is there? And either for those, or if they don't find the goalpost, or if some don't find the goalpost, there's a need for kind of saying, well, you know what, go right on the first turn. Okay.
Sure.
So, if I'm thinking about activation, kind of saying, well, this is the KPI. We need to get an advertiser to perform a meaningful test, and we chose some specific metrics to represent it in terms of like number of conversions and amount of spend. And then we said, well, okay, how, when we didn't move the needle on that, we said like, well, how can we help people do that? And we said, well, let's articulate what are the touch points. So we said, okay, there are 3 touch points: kickoff, launch review, and wrap up, or steps to scale. And we were relatively, I want to say that at that point we were relatively prescriptive with what each touch point means. But I think, the next layer was, well, you know what? I'm not 100% sure that it is being executed in the same way the prescription or, the plan is. Let's say, discovery questions. Are people asking the 5 discovery, like, do people start the conversation with, what is your business about and how are you doing on other channels and what brings you to Taboola? Or are they calling it the kickoff call and doing something different? Or something that is, let's say, is more aligned with the stuff we've done in the past. And then we introduced Gong transcription and recording, which was all about coaching, ultimately. It's like behavior change is not an easy journey or a simple journey or a quick journey. And, you need to kind of have these constant interventions or coaching opportunities present themselves for managers to respond to. And then, once we've done that, we're like, okay, I think kickoff is, we get this right, we don't get this right. We really want advertisers to have a plan. So we introduce another layer to it, which is automatic generation of what we refer to now as like brief to plan. So, for advertisers looking to target insurance leads in the US, what should be their
initial plan,
media plan. And I think it relates to what you said before in terms of like, when you want to do this at scale, which relates to, I guess, what I said before I'm excited about, you need to create some sense of consistency.
Sure.
So, that was a huge part. And then we introduced that and we kind of packaged it with this technology partner called Ever After that I think does a good job at like making it at the very least aesthetically pleasing for the customer. But we also kind of leveraged that partnership to basically set up the logic.
Sure.
And then, I think this is a good story just in terms of like, you need to go gradually, I think. And in terms of like going gradually, you start with, I think, less direction and less process, and you layer on, more pieces as it makes sense. And, at some point, some of them are very kind of enablement oriented, but some of them are about accountability oriented. So we talk about like stuff like pipeline reviews. So create a pipeline. Did you do a kickoff? This account has been pending on so long on and in this stage. What is the next step? Or changing the commissionable target to be not only did they meet the criteria, but also did you actually put the work? Did you provide them a plan? So I think to kind of summarize, the motion around process should be start with a goal that is aligned with your kind of mission and vision and mandate, and then incrementally add processes or tools and components that help either introduce consistency or ideally create uplift, or in a sense, ideally both, to make it so, I guess, people who are not meeting the target are starting to meet it, but also from an organization that has grown as fast as we have. So you and I joined growth in 2019. At the time, there were 10 people. Today, we are 45. I believe that by the end of 2022, purely on the AM side, there would probably be almost double that.
Sure.
That new people coming in don't take a really long time to get to the point where they're effectively, say, activating an account just as a stand-in, but that they are, they're, as some Americans would say, they're dangerous after 30 days or whatever, irrespective, by the way, if they come from the digital advertising industry or not. And I think, again, that creates an opportunity for diversity, which is somewhat counterintuitive for process. Like, you think about process as something that minimizes diversity in people, but if you think about the most important thing in an organization, which is its members,
Sure.
if you have process, if you have that, alignment on methodology, you can actually bring people from all walks of life. And then the most beautiful thing is, because they introduce different perspectives, we have people who were, in previous lives, chefs and worked at companies that produce calling cards and a million other things. They can now inject a fundamentally different view into the next iteration of the process.
Sure.
So, yeah, I think process sometimes is, let's say, underestimated or misunderstood in its ability to actually introduce diversity, at least on a human level.
I think the one way of also assessing the whether this has been successful or not would be to actually look back and see how much longer it perhaps took an AM about 2 years back to onboard and be absolutely ready versus how long it takes today. Also, some of the other aspects that you spoke of, right? I mean, how much more efficient are you? I mean, how much visibility? I mean, the accountability aspect also comes in a little later, but then from the AM standpoint, how much visibility do they have into the work that they are doing? So I think it's a great point. And so in a way, Ken, so it's a bit challenging for you, right? Because the position that you find yourself in, you could perhaps try to learn it all, but you possibly cannot know it all. So there is that really kind of tough balance to maintain. So how then do you drive these changes? And how then do you kind of tell yourself these are changes that are actually working well or not in the initial stages? Of course, we just spoke of how in due course you have these data points, you can derive insights and say if it worked or not. But how do you kind of drive those? And you also briefly touched upon the aspect wherein some of them may not buy into it. So of course you have the conviction, but you do not have the data. There may be people who don't buy into it. So how do you then kind of manage or navigate that sort of situation?
I think, the really short and important answer is you listen. Like, all of these processes, all over these tools, they're all about ultimately two populations. One, the customer, in our case, as a growth advertiser, and second, the account manager to help the advertiser. And I'm going to basically slightly reinterpret, I guess, interpret your question rephrase your question in a specific way to be like, okay, when did we scrap stuff?
Sure.
When did it not work? And how did we? And I think I have two things in my mind. One is the coverage report, which you're familiar with, and the other is general action items, which, without getting too deeply into what they mean, is something that we are in the process of possibly scrapping, right?
Sure.
At the very least, to some extent. So let's start with coverage report again as an example, and we can kind of talk about this on a more abstract level. So the idea was, we kind of started with saying, okay, we have this, North Star anchor type metric called revenue, obviously. What behavior does it inspire an account manager? And the 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 answer was it inspires an account manager to focus on the very thin layer of big accounts. And then we said, well, okay, we want to actually balance that behavior for the account manager to also work on new accounts, which are much harder to get off the ground. 0 to 1 is harder, and so on. And then we introduced activation, which we just talked about, as a metric. And then we said, well, okay, an account manager, as per our service model, services 50 accounts for the existing 10 concurrent, let's say, new onboarding projects or activation projects. Of those 40, let's say, 5 are, big accounts, to whatever degree that means in different regions, but there are still, 35 other accounts. How do we make sure the account manager engages with them in an appropriate way, let's say? And the answer was, well, let's make sure they talk to them at least once a month. And the premise is you don't know what you don't know, right? Like you need to have a conversation with an advertiser to know if they're launching another line of business, how they're doing on other channels and whatnot, and whether there's an opportunity there. And that's how Coverage Report was born. Basically, how many of the accounts that spent in the last 90 days have you spoken to in the last 30 days? And without kind of putting aside the technical challenges there, which did 100% play a part in kind of the adoption, I feel like ultimately the team just didn't buy into this.
Sure.
I think it felt like a dilution of focus, and I think I can't say with like conviction this was about execution, like or how we packaged it, or I should have tried to push it through. But I think we did a good job as a leadership team to say, okay, if there is in the kind of global account director level and the ICs, individual contributor account managers, the sentiment that this is not extremely helpful, let's just scrap it. And I don't think has been completely scrapped in the sense that I believe that on occasion, account managers and account directors kind of leverage it as kind of a target list, like who did I not talk to? But it has certainly been taken back as like a focus, as in, something that comes up in a biweekly, market business review and so on. So I think that's kind of something that's important in terms of like the general action item, which in a nutshell, I believe that emails and instant messages are a huge source of distraction and ultimately stress specifically to account managers. And the concept we wanted to introduce to basically elevate the level of stress-free productivity and correct focus and putting the right balance between responsiveness and kind of quality work is to say, whenever you get an email, you're going to read it only once, and one of 3 things will happen. You're either going to get rid of it because there's no next action, you're going to action it immediately, or you're going to put it in this parking lot, which you're going to decide later. And that parking lot is called the general action items. And this has not taken off. And we recently hypothesized with some members, individual contributors who are leading this operational excellence initiative about what to do it. And we're just now taking a step back and saying, well, you know what? We're not giving up on the goal of stress-free productivity and appropriate balance between, responsiveness and kind of being on top of your email versus kind of doing quality deep work. But maybe this is not the appropriate tool or process or approach for this. Let's take 2 steps back and think about maybe we should be doing this with Gmail labels or a different email client or something else, something that is not Salesforce action items, which we spent a good amount of time building. So
sure.
I think, and by all means, feel free to kind of re-ask the questions if you feel like I rephrased it or responded to a part of it that is less interesting. Go ahead, sorry.
Sure. So I mean, that's exactly what I wanted to understand, because I think in a sense it is important. And it is a tough balance to maintain, right? Because you have the conviction, you have, of course, done the initial round of perhaps conversations, done your due diligence, you kind of invest your time, multiple people kind of lots of resources go into it. And then it's also as important to then kind of listen to the feedback, understand what's actually happening on the ground, and then take corrective measures if required. So I think that pretty much answers that question, Ken. Lastly, before we end this segment, what is the one thing that gives you a lot of satisfaction and pride in what the growth team has done over the last 2.5 years?
Many things. It's hard to choose. I think ultimately there are two sets. Like one is the customer success, and the second is the people success, and people develop. So I guess starting with the latter, I've been incredibly fortunate to been able to kind of, I guess, promote and help people transition from, an individual contributor to a team lead to a full-time people manager to even a manager of managers position. And I think, for those individuals, it has not been always easy. I try to kind of, as a leader or a manager, line manager, kind of be a high challenge, high support. I think people need to be properly stretched and engaged. So I think both hearing them talk to it and also, more importantly, seeing them in action in a fundamentally different form or, behavior than they or approach, I guess, to some issues that they did 2 years ago is extremely satisfying. So that aspect of people development, and I think, it can only happen in an organization that grows, because then there are actually opportunities. An organization that is stagnant, it doesn't, or it's more difficult to create these type of opportunities and kind of let's say execute on that people growth. And then the other piece is advertiser success. So I can think of customers like Sonovia. Speaking of a relatively small business that took advantage of the opportunities, the commercial opportunities created in Corona, and there's been a multi-million-dollar marketing budget, has invested multi-million-dollar marketing budget with Taboola, which has been ROI positive. So probably in the tens of millions worth of commercial value to that company. And we've actually have been with this company, and they're now listed on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. So that has been extremely satisfying. Yeah, I think that's one good story, but I can honestly say there are probably more than 100.
A lot more things.
A lot more of advertisers that like found success. And I think there is another aspect to this, which is, I don't know, let's say there's another aspect which is, to me, like impact that goes beyond our team. So basically, when I see other business units in Taboola adopt some of our approach to onboarding new advertisers, this is not purely on the advertiser side, but also on the publisher side. You leverage the tools that we have introduced. So, walk the path where we kind of broke new ground. There is a certain level of, validation that honestly is extremely satisfying to me as well.
That's a great point. So thank you, Ken, for answering all these. And now we'll move on to the rapid fire questions. I wanted to be a little more cheeky, but then I realized you continue to be my salary planner. So I have perhaps kind of kept that in mind. However, let's see how it goes. So here's the first one. I know for a fact that this first one is going to perhaps annoy you a little bit, but I'm going to ask you nevertheless. Which Big Bang Theory character do you relate to the most? And you have to pick from the options that I give you. Leonard Hofstadter, Rajesh Kutrapalli, Sheldon Cooper, or our favorite, Howard Joel Wolowitz.
It's a tough choice. Honestly, I think more Sheldon, but I wanted to be the lady. What's her name? Katie? No.
Penny. Her name is Penny.
Yes, I wanted to be Penny, but I
Why
think
wouldn't you?
I'm more
I'm,
of a Sheldon.
I'm sorry, I'm kind of cutting in, but then why wouldn't you want to pick Leonard and actually get Penny on your side?
I mean, it's a good
Okay,
question. I don't have an answer. Sorry, we're getting too deep in a show I know too little about.
all right, fair enough. So I'll move on to the next thing. What is the craziest request you have gotten in your professional life?
Ooh, that's a good question. Craziest request.
I can probably give you maybe give you a few seconds to kind of think over while I tell you the craziest thing I've experienced in my professional
Go
life.
ahead.
I went to a client meeting, and by the end of it, I had taken my shirt off. I will not give you more details and leave it to the imagination of the people as to what it could have been. But then, yeah, true story, by the way, happened. So, what's the craziest thing that has happened with you in your professional life?
I mean, I've had some, but I'm really struggling. I'm embarrassed to say it's been so dull. I need to give me some time to think about it. I'll try to get back to you.
Okay, so I'm going to come back to this question. I'm going to let you, and
Yeah.
not let you go without answering this. The next one again
Okay.
is a bit related. What is the most
Okay.
embarrassing thing you have experienced in your school, college life?
School or college life, most embarrassing thing. Oof. Um, Again, unlike the previous question, here I'm spoiled for choice. So many embarrassing things. I think one thing that comes to mind is when I was in the elementary school, or yeah, I think I was probably like 8 or 9. We had a school party in a mall, and
Uh-huh.
so we had lunch, and then at some point we started running, and some kids were chasing me, and I think I turned back to see where are they, and I didn't see, and I fell into a fountain inside the mall. And ever since I and ever since there were a good few months where I was called the scuba diver.
It's not the worst of the names. I mean, being in school, one could get much worse names. So, all
Yeah.
right. So, moving on to the what would you choose? Having a superpower or being able to go invisible, and why?
I mean, I'm not that interested. Well, I think it depends on the superpower. I think I would rather be able to fly, probably fly, or maybe super strength, one of those. And why?
Okay.
Fly, so I can come so I can come for your children's upcoming birth and many other joyous occasions without needing to go through, COVID procedures, and hours on end on an airplane. So, and obviously see my family. I now live in London. Most of my family are in Israel. So I think flying is definitely uh, an attractive one, and the reason is to be able to effortlessly meet the people I enjoy spending time with. Um, yeah, I think that's it.
Awesome. Three words to describe you.
Oof.
Ken, if there was a hamper, you are not going to be winning it for this rapid fire round. So you really got to pick up.
Yeah. I'm sorry. It's not. I'm sorry. I'm not that rapid. Um, I think I want to say funny, or at the very least, I try. Funny, entertaining. That's definitely one. I want to say thoughtful. Like I spend a lot of time like thinking about things. Kind of thinking. I try to think deep. Um, think like maybe somewhere between like competitive and like achievement oriented. Like I want to impact oriented. Like I want to make things happen for my team, for my customers. Like I don't know, some people would say bullish or even aggressive, but I think the more important thing is not necessarily the behavior, but like the why. So yeah.
Sure. The last question, your ultimate ambition.
Or ultimate ambition. I think if we're talking like pure fantasy, it would be, completely reimagining education. You and I have discussed this before in a restaurant in Thailand, I believe.
Sure.
And I can I can describe it relatively at length because I spent some time thinking about that fantasy. I think being a bit more, it's really just about my family, making sure, providing for my family, making sure my family is safe, is healthy, is my wife and children are engaged, or that's everything else is icing on the cake.
Sure. Thank you, Ken. Thank you for answering all the questions. It was great speaking with you. So today's takeaway, I mean, you said a lot of important things, but then today's takeaway is not going to be just based on the conversation we had right now, but more on the basis of the 2.5 years that I've worked with you. So for me, the one thing that stands out is your single-mindedness of never settling on the past achievements and constantly wanting to get better. And this has resulted in complete transformation of the growth advertising team. I mean, I remember, or rather, Tim Cook had once said that they set such high benchmarks in Apple that none of them get a sense of accomplishment despite doing some great things. And I think that's exactly what you have done with the growth team. So from constantly pushing us to becoming better to challenging us on delivering on projects that have a larger impact, I can safely say that your biggest contribution has been in inculcating this growth mindset in us and not really worrying about the short-term gratifications. So thank you, Ken, for doing all this. And thank you for speaking with me on Taboola Talks.
Cheers. Thank you.